This is Seymour Rocks reporting from Down Under. I want to discuss this question. Is ice nucleation being used to mask melting of the sea ice in the Arctic? I want to apologise in advance. This may not be a very professional production. I'm a better writer than I am a video maker, but I hope that I can get the information across. So anyway, here goes. So last year it was announced that there would be a blue sea event by many in the near-term human extinction movement. And Margot and I, we were monitoring the sea ice just about every day during the melt season and watching what was happening. And we could see that this was highly likely. It really looked like it was as close to a blue sea event as one might get. And yet, when the authorities produced the results, it turned out that, in the words of the National Snow and Ice Centre, quote, "This ties 2018 with 2008 and 2010 for the sixth lowest minimum extent in the nearly 40-year satellite record." So the reaction of most people was pretty reflexive. It was, we've dodged the bullet for another year, so maybe this year we won't go extinct, maybe next year we'll go extinct. And I even recall that a gigantic party was organised to celebrate this non-event. Every year that I can think of, since 2012, which set the record for low sea ice, something like this has happened. They've been predicting a blue sea event, for quite a while. So I reckon that Margot and I did a pretty good job of demonstrating that the ice was very, very thin and not of good quality, and it wouldn't take much for it to go. And it depended mostly not on climatic conditions, but on warming from underneath. But in the views of the authorities, even if the ice is mostly slush and it's paper thin, it is considered sea ice extent. And I think that 15% is the figure for this. So in the last, since early last year, we've been observing large amounts of methane coming up, not only from the industrialized countries and from the Siberian permaslush, I won't even call it permafrost, but from underneath the ice in the Laptev Sea. And this from CAMS and in sometime late February illustrates it. Now this would be impossible. It wouldn't happen if the ice was thick as it should be, and if the quality of the ice was sound. Now we also had another riddle, in that some areas where there is high salinity, ice should not be forming at these comparatively high sea temperatures that we were seeing. And it was really hard to make sense of this. We had to compare data from different sources that were often contradictory, meaning Earth Null School and NASA Worldview, and then we had to try and work out just what was happening. But it just really, something didn't quite add up, didn't make sense. So last night I was listening to Jeff Rentz talking to Dane Wigington of Geoengineeringwatch.org, and they were talking about the winter storms in the United States, weather whiplash and the like, in the context of something that I was largely unaware of called ice nucleation. Now, Dane was also saying something that we say, and that the warming on the planet far exceeds what the IPCC and all the establishment are telling us. So I was just listening along until my ears pricked up when he started talking about the Arctic. Unfortunately, the audio clip and the part where he's talking about the Arctic is quite brief, but I thought very meaningful. Well, it's not available yet, but essentially what he was saying was that ice nucleation is being used to artificially nucleate ice on sea surfaces to hide the true state of affairs of Arctic sea ice. So that they can say, I'll say it again, even though the ice is mostly slush, it allows them to say that the sea ice extent, because that's all they go on about, is unremarkable, and therefore the problem isn't as great as what they're they're making out that the problem is not as great as as some of us think. So from where I'm sitting, even though it's highly controversial, most people in the climate change movement won't have a bar of what they call chemtrails, even though the people that I trust don't use the term. But it seems to me like a fairly credible explanation. And it is, of course, a theory. There's no absolute proof. But I would argue that there is plenty of evidence. It's indirect evidence. And this is totally contrary to what the detractors say. And, of course, like everything, one has to, that's not officially sort of sanctioned, we have to join a few dots. But I'm not going to go into that right now, except to say that, to me at least, it would go quite a long way to explain this phenomenon of ice, which is mostly just slush, not melting. So who knows? We could have indeed had a blue ocean event, but they might have kept it from happening by creating a thin layer of ice that has passed off as an unremarkable sea ice thickness. So just before we go on to the Arctic stuff, I would just like to play a little audio clip which might help to explain what ice nucleation is. And this is from a young chap who obviously follows Dane Wigington, and I think he explains it quite well.
Chemical ice nucleation is a process by which geoengineers are able to create conditions in which the temperature of the surrounding environment, the heat, can be absorbed, and they can produce a reaction that makes it possible to create snow, despite the fact that it may not be at freezing point. As we know, water cannot freeze or turn into snow unless it's at the freezing point. So for us, it would be 0 degrees Celsius. For the United States, they use Fahrenheit. It would be 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And if it were 0.01 degrees Celsius, that wouldn't work because it's above the freezing point. You wouldn't be able to see water turn into ice. You might see that it's slowed down. You might see that there are little particles of ice, but it's still a liquid at that point because it needs to be at freezing point in order for it to begin to change over to ice. But what we've found now is that it's possible to create snow even if the conditions are not at the freezing point. And this is possible due to something called an endothermic reaction. So what is an endothermic reaction? Basically, it is when the surrounding area, the heat is absorbed and it's nucleated. So nucle means nucleus, and when it's nucleated, it's moved toward the center. This is done through certain chemistry, chemical bonds, for example. If you use ammonium nitrate and mix it with water, the result is an endothermic reaction whereby the surrounding area is absorbed, the heat is absorbed, and it is turned into a much colder substance. There are plenty of videos on this. It is purely scientific. There's nothing conspiratorial about that. But what is conspiratorial is the fact that this is being used to engineer snowstorms. So even though we're not at temperatures where snow should be a likely result. They are able to actually endothermically create conditions in which snow is the result. So using endothermic reaction, chemical ice nucleation, they are actually able to create snowstorms. So the purpose for this is to give people the illusion that the planet is not boiling right now. You'll notice in
So, the next thing I would like to do is play you a video in its entirety. It's 3 minutes long, and it's a demonstration of an endothermic reaction.
The familiar mushroom cloud snakes skyward, hurling the atom's deadly radiation high into the heavens.
I brought some barium hydroxide octahydrate and some ammonium nitrate, and I'm going to combine them. So that must be the barium, doesn't smell. Ammonium compounds smell. They're both solids, okay? They're both white solids, powdery. There's the ammonium nitrate and there's the barium hydroxide. And I'm going to mix these two together. Hopefully I can get it all in there without spilling it. I put the top on because it generates ammonia, which stinks. And I'm just going to mix it around here. It's an unusual reaction in that it's two solids reacting with one another. Now, you don't see that very often because the point of contact between the two solids is very small. Two spheres touch each other at a point, whereas two gases can completely dissolve in one another, and so you get a lot more reaction going on. But in some cases, two solids will actually react with one another. So as this reaction proceeds, remember that we were releasing 2 moles of ammonia and 10 moles of water for every mole of barium hydroxide. Very endothermic. So I've got this little block of wood here with some water on it. I'm going to show you how endothermic it is by putting this, that's all mixed up. It's a nice slurry now because all that water's been released. And I'm going to stick it on that block, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I can show you just how endothermic this reaction really is. So what I'm claiming is that it's an endothermic reaction, but 3 moles are becoming 13 moles. That's a huge increase in entropy. These two things are solid, they're crystalline, the molecules and the atoms are held in very rigid formations. And there's not very many ways that you can arrange the molecules to get these substances, so the entropy is low. Whereas here we've got aqueous ammonia and liquid water. These molecules can go all over the place, and same with the aqueous barium ions and nitrate ions. So it's a huge increase in entropy, and that's why the reaction goes forth. If the entropy change was 0 or negative, the reaction wouldn't even happen. It wouldn't be spontaneous because the enthalpy is not favorable, and then the entropy wouldn't be favorable either, so you get a non-spontaneous change. This thing should be getting pretty cold by now. Not quite, yeah, it is there. So that block is, it's so cold that it froze the water that I sprayed onto the block, and that's actually frozen right onto the thing. Not gonna let go. That's when it'll break off. Actually, it's there. Yeah, so there's a little chunk of ice. I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but there's some ice on the bottom of this thing. So it actually took it down to below 0. It's so endothermic, plus 80 kilojoules per mole, and yet the reaction goes, and it does so because the entropy change is so large and positive.
So there we are. Now I'd just like to turn to Dane Wigington's article and just read a little bit from that. So he says, chemical ice nucleation processes must be seen to be believed. The vast majority have no idea how powerful chemical nucleating endothermic reacting materials are. The vast majority have no idea that such chemicals are being utilized by the global climate engineering cabal on a massive scale. The use of such patented processes is not just for the engineering winter storms on a rapidly warming world, but the same chemical elements are being used to artificially and chemically nucleate ice on sea surfaces. Power structure funded disinformation, individuals and sources. Of course, never mention chemical ice nucleation and its use by the geoengineers, while putting out completely false information about global cooling or global warming is a hoax. Such false narratives are extremely harmful to the critical cause of exposing and halting climate engineering. Such false narratives are also exactly what the power structure and the geoengineers want. The climate science community also toes the line for the power structure, and boy have we seen this recently. The geoengineers, by never mentioning the ongoing climate engineering insanity in any way, to do otherwise is a very bad career decision or worse. The illegal federal gag order on all National Weather Service, NWS, and all National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, employees, courtesy of the Obama administration, is further proof of this. So there's a gag order over those employees. Sea surface chemical ice nucleation creates extremely anonymous patterns. I'll repeat that because it's important. Sea surface chemical ice nucleation creates extremely anomalous patterns that resemble a chemical spill dispersion, because that's exactly what these patterns are. The recent NASA satellite images, which I'll show now, taken on the polar regions, provide shocking proof of these sea surface patterns. So Dane Wigington has provided pictures from NASA Worldview to illustrate his point. So I'm going to just go through these pictures without comment. Oh, sorry. Don't want the music. Okay, let's go. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. That's the case. And whatever the explanation, well, I would love to find another explanation other than what I'm giving here for these extraordinary pictures. So that's probably enough for me in the meantime. This is Seymour Rocks reporting from Down Under.